We wanted to continue talking about non-infectious causes of reduced reproductive performance in cattle, and at this session we wanted to focus on a condition known as anestrus. Some of the things that some of the goals for learning for this section are: you should be able to explain what the difference is between anovulatory and ovulatory anestrus. You should be able to state at least 10 causes of anestrus in cattle. Know how to detect and diagnose anestrus cows. Be able to describe how the following strategies can be used to treat anestrus cows: nutritional management and management of body condition, hormonal treatment, genetic selection and heifer selection. So hopefully at the end of this session you'll know how to address these learning goals. Definition of anestrus, it really refers to cows that do not show signs of estrus at all during at the expected time. So we normally expect cows to show estrus, or non-pregnant cows to show estrus, every 18 to 24 days, approximately every 3 weeks. And if they fail to do that and they're not pregnant, then they would be regarded as anestrus, that is, failure to show behavioural signs of estrus. There are two types of anestrus, what we call anovulatory anestrus, and this is the absence of estrus behaviour, but it's also not accompanied by ovulation. So anovulatory anestrus, they're not showing heat and they're not ovulating. Ovulatory anestrus, these are cows that are not showing signs of heat, but they are actually ovulating. So ovulatory anestrus, estrus behaviour has not occurred or has not been detected, but the animal has still ovulated. So two different types of anestrus: anovulatory anestrus, not ovulating, not showing signs of heat. Ovulatory anestrus, they are ovulating but they're still not showing signs of heat, or the heat's not being detected. In a normal dairy herd, for example, say a seasonally calving herd, then it's common to have between 10 and 30% of the herd that are actually anestrus at the start of the breeding period. So they're actually not ovulating at the start of the breeding period, and this causes a delay in conception for these cows. Anestrus is a normal part of the early postpartum period, so most cows, they'll calve, and they usually won't start ovulating soon after they calve. They'll usually go into a period of anestrus where they're not ovulating. It only becomes a problem if the cow is still not ovulating when she needs to be bred, and then it becomes an economic problem. It's a major cause of reduced reproductive performance in both beef and dairy herds, as it delays the time from calving to when the cows conceive again, to when they get pregnant. What this happens is usually most farms will have a limited breeding period, so at the end of that period, a lot of the cows that were anestrus at the start of the breeding period, they'll have, by the time they start cycling, they'll have a shorter interval in which to get pregnant. So statistically, a higher percentage of those will be non-pregnant at the end of the breeding season. And so these animals in some herds, like beef herds or some dairy herds, they'll be culled at the end of the year because they're not pregnant. It also means that if they're not cycling at the start of the breeding season, but they then start cycling towards the end of the breeding season, if they get pregnant then they'll have their calves later than would other cows that were cycling at the start of the breeding season. So it tends to spread out the calving pattern, and this reduces things in beef herds such as weaning weights, so that the animals that get in calf late calve late, and then of course when it's time for weaning, their calves are smaller than the other calves. Some anestrus cows can be treated with hormonal treatments, and they can be forced to ovulate. The disadvantage of this is that even if they're forced to ovulate, they'll usually have lower pregnancy rates than cows that are actually cycling and forced to ovulate with an estrus synchronization program. So anestrus is a major economic problem to most beef and dairy herd owners. This is just some data from some herds that I worked with that showed the differences in pregnancy rates that were occurring between anestrus cows and cows that were actually undergoing estrus cycles. So these cows were all subject to estrus synchronization, so they were force ovulated. And within 1 week of the start of mating, you can see that the cycling cows had over 10% more of those cows were pregnant compared to the anestrus cows. By the end of 7 weeks of mating, we can see that there's almost 20% more of the cycling cows are pregnant compared to the anestrus cows. Now this is still not too bad for the anestrus cows, but it means that quite a few of them still are not pregnant compared to the cycling cows, and so that's going to cause delayed conception and increase in culling rates amongst these cows. So it's undesirable to have anestrus cows in the herd when you're trying to start mating, and even if you force ovulate them, you'll still find that their fertility is less than compared to cycling cows. This is just showing you what you would expect on the inside of a cow that is regarded as being anovulatory anestrus. So she's not showing signs of heat and she's not ovulating, and usually the ovaries are small in size, and there's not a lot of active follicular development. There is always a gradation as to when they do start ovulating. There's a progression towards the follicles getting larger, but quite typically for these anovulatory anestrus cows, they'll have relatively small ovaries with not too many large follicles present, and certainly no corpus luteum. When cows calve, as I mentioned earlier, they often are anestrus. The way that the follicles develop on the ovary, remember there's a wave-like pattern of follicular development that occurs in the ovaries of cows. Often the size of the largest follicle on the ovary is quite small when they're after they calve and the cows don't ovulate. As they get closer to the point at which they start to ovulate, the largest follicle on the ovary often gets a little bit larger. So usually if you find a cow that's got large follicles but no corpus luteum, then she's probably getting close to the point where she's ready to ovulate. The other thing I just mentioned, the first postpartum ovulation in cows, so that once they calve, they then go through a period of anestrus and eventually they start to ovulate. Often the first ovulation is not accompanied by signs of heat. So here we have the dominant follicle getting larger with each successive follicular wave within cows as they progress from being deeply in anestrus to the point where they start ovulating. But also we notice that as they start ovulating, often for the first time, there won't be any sign of heat. So these cows will be ovulatory anestrus at this point, whereas this point here they're anovulatory anestrus. Once they've had that first ovulation, progesterone is produced from the corpus luteum. This influences the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus then is ready to stimulate the expression of behavioural signs of estrus on the next cycle. The other thing that happens at the first cycle is that often the duration of the first cycle is shorter compared to subsequent cycles. So once they ovulate the first time, you don't usually have a corpus luteum that hangs around for the normal 16, 17 or so days that we would normally expect. It's usually a lot shorter than that. But once they go into their second cycle and their third cycle, it usually stretches out this luteal period to sort of that 16, 17, 18 day period. So the message here is that the first ovulation postpartum is not always, but quite often is not accompanied by behavioural signs of estrus, and the length of the luteal phase following that ovulation will be generally shorter than normal. Just to mention the concept of depth of anestrus, cows obviously, once they're calved, they're anestrus, they're not cycling. These cows will be harder or take more effort, more energy to cause them to ovulate than cows that still maybe not cycling, but they've had quite a bit of time since they've calved. Those dominant follicles are getting larger, and these cows can be induced to ovulate relatively easily. Again, if they're primed with a bit more extra nutrition, sometimes that will help to induce them to start ovulating. And this is just the concept of depth of anestrus. So a cow that is just calved will be deeply anestrus. A cow that has been calved but maybe 20, 30, 40 days post-calving still hasn't ovulated, possibly won't be as deeply in anestrus. We can apply other things to this. If we have a beef cow that has calves suckling her, then she may be quite deeply in anestrus. It's quite difficult to make her to ovulate. But as the calf gets older and the calf is weaned, she may be in what we call shallow anestrus, and soon she'll start ovulating. And this has important implications for fertility. These cows are less fertile than these cows if you force ovulate them. So it's just the concept of depth of anestrus. The duration of anestrus, how long is anestrus? Well, it's quite variable. It can be as short as 14 days or as long as 80 days or even longer. Some Bos indicus type beef cows that are continuously suckled by their calves, if they're in poor condition, these cows may remain anestrus for more than a year or longer. It's most commonly about 20 to 40 days postpartum that animals will be anestrus for. First calf heifers often have longer calving to first ovulation intervals, so they'll often have a longer anestrus interval compared to, say, cows that have had 3 or 4 calves. And this is because the first calf heifers, by the time they have their calf, they're trying to feed that calf, or if they're a dairy cow, they're trying to milk, but they're still trying to grow as well. So energy is being used both to support milk production and growth, and this puts more nutritional stress on these animals, so it's more likely that they'll take longer to start cycling. How common is anestrus within the herd? It's variable both within a herd and between herds. So from year to year it will vary depending on how much feed is available to the cows, how much stress they've been under, and it will vary from farm to farm. Again, depending on what breed is present, what sort of condition the cows are in, how much feed is available. And as I mentioned earlier, in a seasonal calving herd, 50 to 30% of the cows at the start of mating are commonly anestrus. This is just some results from an Irish study that looked at some statistics from dairy cows. The average interval to the resumption of estrus cycles in dairy cows in Ireland was 36 days, so it took about 5 weeks following calving for those cows to start cycling. About 36% had resumed estrus cycles by day 20 post-calving and 80% by day 40, so most cows within 5 or 6 weeks are starting to ovulate. But there was a group of cows, approximately 12% of cows, that still had not resumed cyclicity by 50 days post-calving. So these are the cows that are more likely to be culled. Less of these cows will get pregnant compared to the ones that start cycling earlier. So these become problem cows. The ones that tended to have the longer intervals to the resumption of estrus cycles post-calving had higher genetic merit for milk production, so they were more likely to produce more milk, and so therefore they're more likely to be in more severe negative energy balance. They had greater negative energy balance when they looked at 100-day milk protein concentration. The concentration of milk protein is an indicator of energy balance within the cow. The lower the milk protein percentage, then the more energy stress that cow has been experiencing. These cows were also at greater risk of being examined or treated for fertility problems. They had a higher incidence of retained placenta, fetal membranes, and or a uterine discharge, that is a uterine infection, post-calving. They took longer before they were detected in heat and inseminated, which you would expect, and they had a longer calving interval. That is, the interval of time between two successive calvings was longer. So these cows, it's just saying these cows that are more than 50 days post-calving before they actually ovulate, they become problem cows. So what are the causes of anestrus? Well, here's a big list of causes. Nutritional anestrus, basically an inadequate amount of feed is being provided to the cows both pre-calving and post-calving. This results in poor body condition, a lack of energy and protein, and the cows might start losing weight and condition. So cows that you want to breed, if they're losing weight or they've lost a lot of weight prior to breeding, then that's not a good thing, and they're more likely to be not cycling, not ovulating. Any particular nutritional deficiency of the macro or macro elements, such as particularly phosphorus, can cause cows to have longer postpartum anestrus intervals. In Australia, this can be a problem, particularly in some beef herds, because a lot of the soils are phosphorus deficient, and so it's important for farmers to supplement with phosphorus in those cases, otherwise their fertility is going to be negatively impacted by phosphorus deficiency. Now this is interesting also. If you feed cows too much, particularly dairy cows, if you feed them too much prior to calving, then they'll also have a longer postpartum anestrus interval. So you want to feed them enough, but you don't want to feed them too much so they get too fat. Otherwise they're more likely to take longer to cycle post-calving. If when they start milking they're not fed enough, so what we call lactational anestrus, the cows stop cycling when they're milking, and this is associated with the cows being in an energy deficit. So they're using more energy than they can actually consume. So this sends a message to the brain that it's not a good time to get pregnant, so they stop ovulating. In beef cows, if they're being suckled, then this will have a negative effect on cyclicity, and they're more likely to be anestrus when they're being suckled, particularly again if they're in poor body condition. Any particular disease that animals have that may exacerbate any negative energy balance, such as severe gastrointestinal parasitism, if they're lame, if they have a any uterine disease such as endometritis, infection of the uterus, or if they're severely sick, these will all have a negative impact on cyclicity, and they're more likely to stop cycling. Obviously, if we have some ovarian tumours, that can cause them to stop cycling, and as we mentioned previously, cystic ovarian disease, one of the common symptoms for that is that they fail to show any signs of heat in some of the cows. If the cows are prepubertal and haven't reached their target weight for breeding, then they're more likely to be anestrus, that is, not showing signs of heat and not ovulating. If you're a first calf heifer and you've had your first calf, and you're still trying to grow and you're trying to milk at the same time, then you're likely to be in negative energy balance. Not a good situation to get pregnant according to their body. So these animals will often have a prolonged period of anestrus. And if there's some sort of developmental defect that the animal's been born with, for example, they may have abnormal ovaries or other structural problems or genetic problems, then this may cause them to not ovulate. So here's a whole range of causes of anestrus that are all of these relate to a failure of the ovary to ovulate. So these all can contribute to a failure to ovulate. Now these are some causes where the cows may be ovulating but they're actually not showing signs of heat. This is what we call silent heat. It may be cows that are particularly nervous, so if they're quite aggressive or they're just very nervous cows, then they may be unwilling to show signs of heat, particularly in the presence of humans. If there are extreme climatic conditions such as excessive heat and humidity, then cows may be less likely to show signs of heat because it's just too hot for them to start riding other cows and being ridden by other cows. Aspects of housing can also have negative effects on estrus behaviour. Some of these include having concrete floors, so the cows are not confident on that surface and they feel like they're going to slip if they're showing signs of heat, and so they're more reluctant to show signs of heat. And again, if they're affected by any sort of illness, particularly lameness or any other illness, they may not show signs of heat. So causes of behavioural anestrus, things that are affecting the behaviour of the cow or suppressing the estrus behaviour of the cow. Now occasionally you'll have some conditions that cause a prolongation of the luteal phase of the cycle. So the corpus luteum normally hangs around for 16 to 18 days, but in some cases it persists on the ovary. And in the presence of high concentrations of progesterone, usually cows don't show signs of heat. What can cause prolonged concentrations of progesterone? Sometimes it just happens and we're not quite sure why. It's just called a prolonged diestrus, not very common, but occasionally. Other times it can be due to pyometra, so there's actually pus in the uterus, and this inhibits the release of prostaglandin from the uterus, so luteolysis doesn't occur, and so you get a persistence of diestrus and the cow doesn't show heat. If the cow happens to be pregnant, then progesterone remains high and they don't usually show signs of heat. Occasionally they will, but not very often. If the cow is actually pregnant and subsequently undergoes early embryonic loss, so that corpus luteum will be present while the cow is pregnant, and then as that embryo dies and the uterus clears the embryo, only then will they be able to show signs of heat as progesterone levels fall back to baseline levels. This is an important cause of failure of cows to show heat, because what happens is farmers inseminate the cow, she actually conceives, she doesn't return to heat within sort of 18 to 24 days. The farmer thinks that she's pregnant. She might actually take longer, she might take 60 days before she actually shows sign of heat. If the farmer misses that heat, then sometimes it's not until pregnancy testing that the farmer finds out that this animal is actually not pregnant, and they're wondering, well, why is she not pregnant? Because I haven't seen her come back in heat. And it's probably because she was pregnant but she lost the embryo at a certain stage prior to the pregnancy testing. Of course, cows can be anestrus, not because they really are, but because we fail to detect them in estrus. And this is due to a heat detection problem. So maybe we don't know, the farmer may not know how to recognise heat, they're not spending enough time recognising heat, they're not using aids for detecting heat. Now some cows that have a high milk production, and then they're in the early postpartum period, so they're exposed to quite a bit of negative energy balance. If they do start ovulating, sometimes they'll show weaker signs of heat than cows that are in good body condition, and the duration of their estrus may be shorter, so they're often harder to detect in heat. So failure to detect heat, this can be another cause of why cows may appear to be anestrus. This is just to talk a little bit about the effect of suckling on some of the reproductive physiology. When cows are being suckled, they often stop ovulating. One of the reasons is that suckling causes negative energy balance because it's consuming milk from the cow, and if she can't eat enough food to supply that need, then the cow will be in negative energy balance. But it also suckling has a negative effect on the secretion of luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. So it will suppress GnRH secretion from the hypothalamus, which will suppress, which means that you won't get as much LH released from the anterior pituitary gland. Now, if you wean that calf, or if you limit them to suckling only 2 to 3 times per day, LH pulse frequency will go up. That's because there's an increase in GnRH pulse frequency, and this can result sometimes in cows ovulating. So here they're not ovulating because LH is just too low, It's not stimulating follicular development very well. But once you wean the calf or reduce the number of times a day the cow's suckled, LH pulse frequency goes up. It drives the growth of the follicles a little bit harder. They're producing more estrogen, and that has a positive feedback on the hypothalamus, and you may get an LH surge. So just that increase in LH pulse frequency is enough to stimulate enough estrogen production to induce ovulation. So sometimes in a beef herd, particularly in a village situation, they may not be able to remove the calf from the cow, but if you want to get the cow pregnant, sometimes you can say, well, okay, let's restrict the suckling to 2 or 3 times per day, and that might allow the cow to ovulate. It's not quite as simple as that. It's been shown that in an intact cow, so a cow that all the nerves are intact down to the udder, that this is what happens, which is what we've just described. If we wean the calf, we suddenly get an increase in LH pulse frequency. In this experiment, what they did was they cut the nerves that supply the udder, and so that the cow couldn't actually sense when the calf was suckling. And if you wean the calves in these cows where they've been denervated, you'll find that there's also an increase in LH pulse frequency. So what this experiment showed, that just the physical presence of the calf also influences the secretion of GnRH and LH from the pituitary gland. So it's not just about suckling, but it's also about the presence of the calf that has a psychological effect on LH pulse frequency. In beef cows, at the time of calving, you want beef cows to calve in moderate body condition. You don't want them too fat, but you certainly don't want them skinny. And if they calve in moderate body condition, this is a good moderate body condition in this cow here, then the duration of anestrus won't be too long following calving. Also depends on how much feed is available once they do calve. But if this cow was skinny, she'll take a lot longer to cycle once she's calving. Once she has calved. Now this is really just illustrating how if you feed cows too much, particularly this is data from dairy cows, you can actually delay ovulation as well. So the yellow line here refers to cows that were fed a balanced diet. So just the sort of diet that was probably ideal for them prior to calving. So here they are, this is their calving point here. They're fed the balanced diet prior to calving. As you'd expect, their energy balance after calving drops, and that's typical, and then it picks up over a few weeks, and then they have their first ovulation here. Now if we feed them an excessive amount of food prior to calving, which is this red line here, so energy balance is way up in the positive here, we're feeding them too much, we find that it actually delayed their first postpartum ovulation interval. So the message is feed cows prior to calving at the right amount that they need. Don't feed them too much, just feed them what they need. If you feed them too much, there's a risk that you'll actually delay ovulation. How do you detect cows that are anestrus? Well, really, prior to the start of mating, you just have to try to detect heat, and we can use things such as tail paint and monitor the cows over 3 to 4 weeks and record those cows where the tail paint gets rubbed or that you actually see them in heat, and these cows can be classified as cyclers. Sometimes farmers will ask veterinarians to palpate cows for the presence of a corpus luteum, because they'll start mating and they'll say, well, 3 to 4 weeks after the start of mating, they'll say, can you check those cows because I haven't seen them in heat and I just want to make sure they're ovulating. And so they'll ask the vet to check for the presence of a corpus luteum. The problem is, by waiting 3 to 4 weeks after mating has started, these cows are already late cows, and then if you're going to treat them, it's then going to take a number of days to treat them, and so they're not going to get pregnant for until at least week 5 or 6 or longer. So if you're going to detect anestrus cows and then do something about them, then I suggest you do it prior to the start of the breeding season, so that right at the start of the breeding season these cows can be treated rather than wait 3 to 4 weeks before you realise that you've got a problem. So this is a bit of an overview of some of the definitions and causes of anestrus in cows, and perhaps you can take some time now just to review the material and to go over these questions. So what's the difference between ovulatory and anovulatory anestrus? Well, in ovulatory anestrus the cows are actually ovulating, but they're not showing signs of heat, or we're not detecting heat. In anovulatory anestrus they're actually not ovulating and not showing signs of estrus. Some of the causes of anestrus in cows, well, we had quite a number back here. In this slide here, a whole lot of things that relate to inadequate nutrition, suckling disease, cystic ovarian disease, or if they haven't reached puberty yet, or if they've had their first calf and they're under nutritional stress, developmental defects. Other causes can be things that can inhibit behaviour, such as illness, concrete floor, nervous disposition. Sometimes we can have prolonged luteal function. This could be due to pyometra, a pregnancy, or early embryonic loss. And then we can also have a failure to detect estrus. So a number of causes of anestrus that you should be aware of. What's the physiological mechanism by which suckling can prolong the postpartum period of anestrus? Well, there's a couple of mechanisms at play here. First of all, the suckling effect has an inhibitory effect on the secretion of GnRH, and therefore if you've got less GnRH released, you've got less a lower pulsatile release of LH from the anterior pituitary, and so you've got less stimulation of the growth and development of ovarian follicles, and so it's difficult for those cows to ovulate in that kind of environment. The other effect of suckling is that it will remove milk from the cow, and that can cause that means if she's not eating enough, then she'll be in negative energy balance. And then finally, the other effect of suckling is that simply the presence of the calf with the cow seems to have an inhibitory effect on GnRH and subsequently LH secretion.